Life is a very complicated thing and sometimes brings us such trials that we could not have imagined. As I sat there, I found myself reflecting on the past few weeks, trying to piece together any solid proof of Milou's betrayal. My gut was in knots, and every small incident that had built up over time only deepened the unease I couldn't shake. Something was definitely off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Even though I felt strongly that something was going on, I had nothing concrete, no real evidence, no details about who, what, or where. This uncertainty kept me on my toes, making me wonder if I was winding myself up in the fact that she had abandoned me. Despite all my second-guessing, my instincts kept screaming that something wasn't right. Whether it was the start of an affair or just a one-time thing, the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. I'd been chewing on these thoughts for what seemed like forever, but I couldn't help but ask myself how long this had been happening before I even caught on. I took another slow sip of my Jack Daniels and gave the bartender a nod. He shot me a half-smile like he'd seen this kind of troubled look 1,000 times before. The bar was quiet, filled with low chatter that blended into the background, and the mood was just as dreary as the weather outside. The faces of the people around me were lifeless, like they were just waiting out the rain before heading back home. The only woman there, dressed way too fancy for this place, looked like she was desperate for attention as she accepted drinks from an older guy. He seemed hopeful, though he probably didn't need to try so hard. She was already into him. Most of the other patrons were just killing time, waiting for a reason to leave. I was still sitting there, unsure about what to do next, when I heard a voice behind me. Turning around, I saw Nicole standing there, her eyes cutting right through me like she could see straight into my soul. When I tried to respond, the words just wouldn't come. In the dim light, her coat dripping from the rain outside, she started to take it off, and I couldn't help but wonder why she was here. So, I asked her. She said she was worried about me and had a hunch she'd find me at this bar. She suggested we sit down and talk. I just stared at her, trying to figure out her angle and whether I could really trust her. I needed to steady myself, so I took another swig of my drink and ordered her a vodka and soda. We waited for the bartender to move on before picking the conversation back up. Our eyes met, both of us unsure and quietly vying for control of the situation. Nicole pointed out that she had noticed something was weighing on me lately, like I was carrying a burden too heavy to bear. I met her gaze for a second, but then looked away. There was something unspoken between us, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge it. I told her everything was fine, trying to downplay the whole thing. But she wasn't buying it. My heart sank as I realized that no matter how much I tried to brush it off, she could see right through me. She set her glass down, laced her fingers together, and leaned in slightly. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me she knew what was going on. I played dumb, acting like I didn't know what she was talking about, but Nicole wouldn't let it go. She suggested we move to a booth for some privacy, and even though I wasn't thrilled about it, I went along with her. Once we were settled, I asked her what she thought she knew, trying to change the direction of the conversation. But Nicole saw right through my attempt to dodge the subject. She reminded me that after everything we'd been through, I couldn't lie to her. She was right. I'd known Nicole since she was 17, back when I first started dating Milou. She'd always been around, and she'd even had a crush on me back then, though I ended up marrying her sister. As the years went by, Milou and I got married and built what I thought was the perfect life together. We both had decent jobs, earned enough money to be comfortable, and on the outside, everything seemed fine. Meanwhile, Nicole had grown into a beautiful, confident woman. By the time she hit her mid-20s, she was the kind of woman any guy would be lucky to know, let alone be close to. But now, as I sat across from her in that bar, I couldn't shake the feeling that my marriage, which was coming up on its 5-year anniversary, might not make it to 6. Nicole, with her concerned eyes, could see the hurt I was trying so hard to hide. Before I could stop myself, I felt my heart shattering as she spoke the words I had been dreading. She told me, bluntly, that she believed Milou was cheating on me. My mind went blank for a moment, and I tried to process what she was saying. I didn't want to hear it, and I definitely didn't want to believe it. I figured if I didn't acknowledge it, then maybe it wasn't real. Maybe if I just ignored the signs, I could avoid the pain that came with facing the truth. Nicole must have noticed my blank expression because she asked if I was in shock or just in denial. She told me she loved me and was worried that I wasn't seeing things clearly. Part of her even hoped it was all a big misunderstanding. But I kept brushing her off, determined to keep lying to myself. Nicole's frustration boiled over, and her eyes flashed with anger, catching the bartender's attention. I quickly reassured him that everything was fine, and Nicole apologized for causing a scene. She was mad at me, but it was out of concern. She wanted me to wake up, to see the situation for what it was. She said we needed to do something about it, and I reluctantly agreed to hear her out. She started telling me about an incident from a few weeks back when she was hanging out with Milou. Apparently, Milou got a call on her phone and walked out of the room to take it. That struck Nicole as odd since they were sisters and usually shared everything. I nodded, feeling that familiar pit of dread settle in my stomach. Nicole went on to say that later, she checked Milou's phone and noticed there wasn't even a locked code on it. The call was from a guy listed as Lucas, but Nicole had no clue who that was. She decided to keep an eye on things and waited to see if it would happen again. After about a week, Nicole figured out who this Lucas guy was. He was someone Milou had known years ago, long before I came into the picture. They had reconnected recently, probably through social media or some chat app, and apparently, they'd been messaging each other for weeks. I told Nicole that I hadn't noticed anything like that going on, though I had felt there was a growing distance between us lately. Nicole nodded, acknowledging my concerns but explaining that Milou and this guy weren't doing anything obvious, just little things that seemed to fit together all too conveniently. I asked if maybe it was just two old friends catching up over messages, but Nicole shook her head, suggesting it had gone further than that. Her answer caught me off guard, so I asked if I had somehow missed any signs that were right in front of me. I told her how everything lately seemed to be working against us, leaving no room for fun or connection. Nicole just stared at me, disbelief written all over her face. "You've got to stop burying your head in the sand," she said, reminding me how much she cared about me. I pressed her for more, desperate to understand how bad things really were. The look in her eyes was all the confirmation I needed, and that flicker of truth ignited a slow, simmering rage deep inside me. I immediately demanded to know the details: when, how, and where had these meetups happened. Nicole told me that Milou had seen this other guy at least 3 times in the last 2 weeks. She wasn't completely sure at first, but 2 days ago, during lunch with a friend who worked with Milou, some information slipped out. Her friend mentioned Milou had met the guy twice for lunch and once for dinner just last week. Nicole asked if any of that lined up with what I'd noticed lately. As I mulled over what Nicole said, I remembered a couple of times recently when I'd called Milou's office to meet for lunch, only to be told she wasn't there or had already gone out. Was that when she was seeing him? Then, there was that seminar she claimed to have gone to last week. It was a last-minute work event that ran late, and she didn't get home until after midnight. She'd said the seminar dragged on and that the team grabbed a drink at the hotel bar to wind down afterward. I remembered how there was no intimacy that night. She just went straight to the shower and then to bed. My mind was racing, struggling to make sense of it all. Seeing how upset I was, Nicole warned me not to act recklessly, reminding me that I didn't want to do something I'd regret or land myself in any legal trouble. But I had already made up my mind. My expression must have given it away, because she looked worried as I declared that I wasn't going to let this go on any longer. I told her I wouldn't stand for a cheating partner and vowed that both Milou and this other guy would pay for what they had done. Nicole urged me to slow down and not act impulsively without a clear plan. Oddly, her calm voice helped me rein in the anger, solidifying what I already knew deep down: my suspicions were real. I asked if she had any idea where Milou was at that moment, and Nicole said she was probably with him. That's why she had come to find me. That answer made my blood boil, and I slammed my fist on the table, drawing stares from the other bar patrons. I signaled the bartender and turned back to Nicole. "Do you know where they are right now?" I asked, my voice thick with anger. She didn't know the exact location but said she'd talk to Milou tomorrow to gather more information. Apparently, the guy was married and had kids, though Nicole wasn't sure where he lived. She promised to find out more to help me. I reached across the table and grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly as I wiped away a tear from her cheek. "Thank you," I whispered, appreciating her support despite the awkwardness of the situation. Nicole looked at me with concern, asking what I planned to do next. I reassured her that I wouldn't act on impulse, at least not yet, but I was determined to put an end to it. I told her there would be no forgiveness for either of them and that I would make sure they paid for their betrayal. In the meantime, I needed to protect what was mine and start gathering proofs. As I downed the last of my Jack, I motioned for the bartender and left him a tip. Nicole still looked uneasy as she asked when I planned to confront Milou. I thought about it for a moment, telling her I'd make a few calls tomorrow and start securing my assets. I made it clear I wasn't going to let Milou take a single penny from me. Nicole pointed out how hard it must be living with her while knowing what was happening, and I admitted that the past few weeks had been hell. If Milou hadn't picked up on my distance by now, she probably never would. Nicole stood to leave, saying we should talk again tomorrow. I agreed, and she promised to dig up more details for me. As she slipped on her coat, I helped her, and for a moment, standing so close to her, she looked so much like Milou. Tears welled up in her eyes as she gazed up at me, and I kissed her gently on the cheek, assuring her that I'd be all right. She smiled softly before disappearing into the rainy night. I sat back down, taking a deep breath as I began to plot my next move. One thing was certain, they wouldn't get away with this. My revenge would be swift, cold, and without mercy. After that, everything was a blur. Somehow, I woke up in my own bed the next morning, my mouth dry, my head pounding like a drum. Rolling over, I saw that Milou was already gone, though I could hear faint noises coming from downstairs. Swinging my feet over the edge of the bed, I stood, trying to shake off the hangover. As I staggered into the bathroom, my mind swirled with thoughts of last night and what was to come. Entering the kitchen, I found Milou already there. She looked me over and casually asked what kind of state I was in. I mumbled something about meeting up with an old friend and having one too many. I poured myself a glass of orange juice, downed it, then poured another. She pressed me for more details, asking who the friend was. That's when I realized I needed a story. I mentioned a guy named Lucas, an old buddy from college who was in town on business. At the name Lucas, I noticed the tiniest flicker of recognition on her face before she quickly turned away. I went on, talking about our days playing football together in college. Milou acted like she didn't remember him, but brushed it off, saying it didn't matter as long as I had a good time. It was the first warning sign. Sitting across from me, Milou was unusually distant, like she wasn't really there. I casually brought up her evening, trying to sound uninterested, but watching her closely. She claimed she had finished work and grabbed a quick meal and drink with her coworkers, getting home around 9:30. But I knew better. I had been home until 10, before heading to the bar. That was the second glaring sign. She continued talking about her plans for the day, mentioning she might be late again. Then, almost offhandedly, she mentioned that Lucas, an old friend of hers, was supposed to get in touch. I forced a smile and suggested she invite him over so we could all catch up. She hesitated, then agreed, asking if I really remembered Lucas. Her voice was casual, but something felt off beneath the surface. I reassured her I was fine and that I could handle things myself. My mind was already racing, forming the next steps of my plan. After finishing my juice, I popped a couple of painkillers and told her I needed to get ready for the day. As I left the house, one thing was crystal clear: this wasn't over. Milou and her lover had no idea what was coming for them. As I dressed, my determination hardened. This charade had gone on long enough. The thought of her being with Lucas stoked a fire of rage inside me, and with each passing minute, my need for revenge intensified. My anger toward him, a man I barely knew, grew stronger by the second. The workday was a blur of chaos, constant phone calls, urgent meetings, and issues that refused to let up. My secretary managed some of the calls, but there was no avoiding the important ones. Despite the hectic schedule, the tension inside me kept building, fueled by a burning desire for payback. By mid-morning, the rush finally eased, leaving me with a few minutes to handle my own matters. I shut my office door and got to work on my finances. Within 45 minutes, I'd secured everything, moving funds out of reach, tightening control over our joint account. I even scheduled a meeting with a solicitor to discuss the logistics of divorce. Though I had a few more days to gather solid evidence, I doubted it would even matter in the end. Milou had her own accounts, but the joint one was my main concern, and now it was safely locked down. My personal accounts were secure, and with no kids in the picture, the divorce would be straightforward if it came to that. I realized the only way forward was if Milou admitted to her wrongdoing and begged for forgiveness. If she hesitated even a little, we were done. The weight of that thought settled on me like a heavy stone. It saddened me, but there was no turning back now. I sat quietly at my desk, reflecting on everything that had happened, everything I had done so far. I needed more information about Lucas, more proof. Or maybe just knowing the truth was enough to bring them down. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. It was Nicole. I told her I was tied up with some plans but had already taken steps to protect myself. She filled me in on more details about Lucas Peters, including the fact that he was married. She had his home address and workplace, thanks to a friend who had spotted him with Milou. According to Nicole, things between them were escalating, even though they were trying to keep it quiet. Feeling like I finally had something concrete, I asked for all of Lucas's information. In no time, I found his social media profile and stared at his photo. His face triggered a faint, unsettling memory, one that I couldn't quite place. I decided to stir the pot a little, so I called Milou around lunchtime. During the conversation, she mentioned she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Peters. The casual mention of his name felt like a slap in the face, a twisted taunt. I bit back my emotions, keeping the conversation light, though inside, I was seething. Strike three, I thought, making up my mind that swift, ruthless action was the only way forward. After hanging up, I sat there for a moment, gripping the edge of my desk, teeth clenched in anger. I promised to see her later, barely able to stomach her saying, "I love you." My secretary walked in, offering to grab lunch from the deli down the street. I barely looked up but told her to bring me something rich in red meat, something I could tear into. She gave me a curious glance but didn't press further, closing the door behind her. She'd noticed my strange behavior all morning, sensing that something was simmering just below the surface. Meanwhile, Nicole was doing her own bit of recon. She dropped by Milou's office and saw her stepping out of the elevator with a tall, dark-haired man, none other than Lucas Peters. Nicole confronted Milou on the spot, casually asking Lucas how long he'd known her. Lucas, clearly caught off guard, stammered as Milou quickly pulled him aside, claiming they had a meeting to get to. They hurried outside and got into a waiting cab, but not before Milou shot a nervous glance back at Nicole. Back at my office, I chewed slowly on a massive sub, savoring each bite of red meat as I mulled over my next move. Nicole called to confirm that Milou had left the office, and a quick check with her secretary revealed that she wouldn't be back for the rest of the afternoon. My finances were locked down tight, and I had a locksmith on standby, ready to change the locks at a moment's notice. My lawyer was also prepped, just waiting on the final details from me. Tonight would be the first step in my plan. I wasn't going to tip my hand right away. I wanted to mess with them a bit before making my final move. My dad always said, never let them see you coming, just go straight for the kill. Maybe I'd forgotten that for a while, but it was about to change. That evening, Milou walked through the door looking like her usual self, as if nothing had changed. Everything seemed normal, until I caught the faint scent of men's cologne clinging to her clothes. As I leaned in to kiss her, she noticed my hesitation. Without a word, I gave her a light peck on the cheek and headed for the door. She called after me, asking if everything was okay and what my plans were. I reassured her I was fine but mentioned I had a poker game with some colleagues from work, hoping it would be enough to keep her off my back. Once I was out the door, I got in my car, grinding my teeth as I pulled out of the driveway. I headed to Dan's place, my mind swirling with everything I had planned. Dan was a longtime friend, the kind of guy you could count on no matter what. He had a rough history with the law and plenty of combat training, which made him the perfect partner for what I had in mind. He didn't hesitate when I called him earlier, no questions, just loyalty. Exactly what I needed right now. When I arrived at his place, we went straight to his garage. There, I changed into dark overalls and pulled on a ski mask. We looked like a couple of mime artists, dead silent as we got into an old, beat-up car Dan had picked up a while back. The kind of car nobody would look twice at. We drove across town, heading for the address Nicole had given me. No need for words, we'd already gone over the plan. Dan parked the car outside Lucas Peters's house, and we waited in silence. The house was dark, save for a single light inside. Eventually, the front door opened, and Lucas stepped out. He got into his car and drove away. We followed at a safe distance, no need to rush. We knew where he was going. At the driving range, we parked in the shadows and waited. The car park gradually emptied, leaving only a few vehicles behind. My anger boiled beneath the surface, making it hard to sit still. Every part of me wanted to storm in there and confront him, but I knew it wasn't time yet. So, we waited. As Lucas made his way back to his car, Dan slipped out of our vehicle and approached him with practiced stealth. Once the job was done, I quietly drove us out of the parking lot, doing my best not to attract any attention. Dan, removing his gloves and mask, commented on how smoothly everything had gone. I thanked him sincerely, expressing how much I appreciated his help. Dan shrugged it off, saying he still owed me and could never fully repay me for what I'd done for him in the past. I reminded him that we were friends, and friends have each other's backs. At least, I added, his hands were clean, and there were no security cameras in the car park to worry about. Satisfied with the night's work, we decided to head back. Dan suggested we join the others for a poker game, as the guys were probably already at his place by now. We spent the next 4 hours playing cards, the atmosphere light and supportive. The guys knew something was going on with me and offered the kind of understanding that boosted my confidence for what was coming next with Milou. Before I confronted her, though, I had plans to mess with her mind a bit. I stumbled through the front door just after 1 a.m., exaggerating how drunk I was. Dan had arranged for one of the guys to drop me off in my car. Milou, who had stayed up waiting for me, immediately questioned why I was so late, scrutinizing me with suspicious eyes. I waved off her concern, slurring slightly as I told her Dan and the guys had dropped me off, and that I'd had too much Jack Daniels. I barely managed to hang my jacket on the peg, missing entirely, before collapsing onto the sofa. Milou sat across from me, arms crossed and disgust etched on her face. I kept my expression blank, waiting for her to say something. She didn't hold back long, asking, "What's going on with you, Evelio? Is there someone else? You've been acting really weird lately." I bit back the anger that surged inside me and forced a chuckle. Reminding myself to keep calm, I said, "I'm fine." Just going through a rough patch, but don't worry, it'll all be over soon." My words hung in the air, leaving her confused but on edge, knowing something was off but unsure what. We went to bed, and I pretended to pass out, immediately faking sleep. It frustrated her, as she seemed ready for a confrontation, but I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction just yet. The next morning, she was up first, making coffee. I dragged myself downstairs, putting on a show of being hungover, all the while being obnoxious. I playfully greeted her and rubbed my temples, mentioning my pounding headache. She tossed me some headache medicine without much enthusiasm. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed her phone sitting on the kitchen table. I could sense her unease, as if she was tempted to grab it, but didn't want to seem suspicious. I poured some orange juice and casually picked up her phone, making it look like I was just moving it out of the way. A flash of panic crossed her face as I briefly glanced at an incoming message. Handing it back to her, I remarked that it looked like the battery was low and she didn't want to miss any important messages. I left the kitchen without another word, heading upstairs to get dressed. Milou stared after me, clearly rattled, wondering if I knew something but trying to convince herself I was still in the dark. She thought she'd been careful. After all, this affair had only been going on for a few weeks. A couple of lunches, dinners, and 3 hotel stays. To her, it was just harmless fun, and she believed I'd never find out, especially since she didn't think I was lacking anything at home. As I rushed downstairs, I avoided Milou's attempt at a more intimate goodbye, slipping out the door with a quick wave and a forced smile. I headed to work, eager to set more of my plan in motion. Around 11 a.m., I sent Milou a text for fun, saying I was sorry for being distant lately and that I had a lot on my mind but promised her everything would be sorted out soon. I leaned back, waiting to see how she would respond. Later that day, Nicole dropped by my office, her face full of concern. She asked me what had happened, particularly regarding Lucas. I played dumb at first, prompting her to reveal more. That morning, someone at the golf club had found Lucas Peters in the trunk of his car, badly beaten. Milou had confided in Nicole, clearly shaken by the news. Nicole asked me point-blank if I was involved. I dismissed the idea, acting indifferent and denying any involvement. I explained that Milou had mentioned Lucas's condition through a work-related meeting. They had called to inform her that Lucas had been hospitalized, and his wife confirmed it. Nicole seemed to accept my explanation, though she warned that next time, things might not be as easy for them. When she asked what I meant by that, I just smiled and said, "Accidents happen in the strangest places." That evening, when I got home, Milou was gone, and her car wasn't in the driveway. Feeling annoyed, I called her, cheerfully asking where she was. She told me she was at the hospital visiting a friend and assured me she wouldn't be long. I wished her friend a speedy recovery and hung up before she could respond. About half an hour later, Milou walked through the door, looking exhausted. I casually inquired about her friend's condition, hoping it wasn't anything too serious. Milou hesitated for a moment, then said it wasn't anything major, just a minor accident, and her friend would be home soon. Her voice sounded shaky, like she was trying to hold it together, but I could tell something had rattled her. I offered to make coffee, and Milou, looking a little more relaxed, thanked me. As we sipped our drinks, she casually mentioned that one of her company's reps had been attacked recently. Feigning surprise, I asked her for more details. She explained that Lucas had been assaulted and left in his car overnight, but reassured me he wasn't seriously hurt. She suggested the attackers only meant to scare him, as nothing was stolen. I could barely keep a straight face, knowing full well how my earlier denial of even knowing Lucas might have made the situation more complicated. Milou seemed to catch my skepticism, her face tightening as she realized she might have said too much. Quickly, she tried to change the subject, but it was too late. I had already connected the dots. She hurriedly left the room, probably to make a phone call. I knew I needed to move fast now, things were escalating, and it was time to act. Calling out to Milou, I told her I needed to step out for a bit and wouldn't be long. Without waiting for her reply, I got in my car and drove straight to Lucas Peters's house. I knocked on the door, and a petite, dark-haired woman answered. I introduced myself as Evelio Collins and told her that my wife, Milou, had been having an affair with her husband. Her face immediately turned pale, and though she was clearly rattled, she invited me inside. Sitting in the living room, I laid it all out for her. I apologized for bringing bad news, but I thought she had the right to know. I also informed her that Lucas was currently in the hospital. She broke down, confirming what she had suspected for a while. She said she had known Lucas was cheating again but hadn't had any solid proof until now. She was fed up with his lies and told me she was going to divorce him, no questions asked. She wasn't sure how long the affair with Milou had been going on but had no doubt in her mind that Milou was involved. When I asked her about the recent attack on Lucas, she admitted she had no idea who could have done it. I clarified that I had nothing to do with it but, truthfully, wasn't sorry it happened either. We speculated about whether Lucas might have gotten himself mixed up with someone else's wife. Her bitter reply, "Nothing surprises me anymore," said it all. She explained that they had moved back to the area because of Lucas's past infidelities, but it was clear he hadn't changed. Before I left, I gave her the contact information for my locksmith and solicitor, figuring she'd need them soon. As I drove home, my mind was laser-focused on what needed to be done next. The anger I felt was sharp and controlled, fueling my need for thorough, satisfying revenge. The end of my marriage weighed heavily on me, but there was no turning back now. Milou had betrayed me, and there would be no forgiveness. The only comfort I had was knowing that the pain she caused me would come back to haunt her. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Milou's car parked in its usual spot. As I tapped the hood absent-mindedly, I realized this might be the last time I'd walk through this door as a married man. Each step toward the house felt heavier than the last. I entered and could feel the weight of recent events pressing down on me like a physical force. The television hummed in the background as I approached the living room. Milou was perched on the sofa, tense, her body language screaming unease. It was as if she knew everything was about to unravel. Her posture was stiff, and her eyes trembled as they met mine, desperately trying to hold it together. I stood silently, staring at her, letting her squirm under the weight of my gaze. I could see the panic behind her eyes, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. Without a word, I walked past her and headed straight for the liquor cabinet. I poured myself a stiff drink, never taking my eyes off her. She sensed the shift but couldn't read my expression. As I took a slow sip, her unease deepened. Trying to gather herself, Milou straightened up, attempting to regain some control. She finally broke the silence, asking where I had been with a touch of frustration in her voice. I stared at her blankly, then told her I'd reveal my whereabouts if she first told me where she had been. Her eyes darted nervously, and she stammered that she had been at the hospital with a friend. I held her gaze, letting her lie hang in the air, watching her squirm. She tried to shift the conversation back to me, but I cut her off, tired of the charade. I mentioned that I'd met someone today, someone new, but who had become a quick friend. I then casually dropped Lucas Peters's name, watching with satisfaction as Milou's face went ghostly pale. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind as she tried to figure out what I knew. Feigning concern, she asked if I was all right and offered to get me another drink. I pressed her further, asking her directly about Lucas, letting her feel the full weight of her deception. I laid it all out. I told her I had known about her affair with Lucas for some time now. She immediately tried to downplay it, insisting it was nothing serious, just a fling. I scoffed at her weak excuses, reminding her of the vows we made and telling her how angry I was to have been treated like a fool. She apologized, saying it didn't mean anything and promised to make it up to me. I laughed bitterly and told her she was only sorry because she got caught. I demanded to know if she would have ever stopped if I hadn't found out. The truth was written all over her face. She wouldn't have. I told her lies had become second nature and that she wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with anymore. As my words sank in, her bravado crumbled. She desperately asked what she could do to fix things, promising she'd do anything. But I'd already made up my mind. It's too late, I said coldly. We're done. I called Nicole and explained the situation, asking her to come over and help Milou pack. Milou, still in shock, asked where she was supposed to go. I told her bluntly that she could go anywhere, even back to her lover at the hospital, for all I cared. When Nicole arrived, she didn't hesitate. She quickly packed Milou's belongings into a couple of suitcases while I stood by, watching the woman I once loved being ushered out of my life. Despite everything, I still wanted to make sure she left safely, but that was the last shred of care I could offer her. There would be no second chances, no coming back into my life. She was gone, and there was no turning back. It is possible to stumble in life once and realizing that it is a big mistake to try to correct everything at once. I didn't see that she wanted to make things right.